Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might seem absurd at first. What if I told you that the most valuable commodity in human history wasn't gold, wasn't silver, wasn't diamonds or oil, but something sitting in a shaker on your dinner table right now? For more than 1,000 years, empires rose and fell across the Sahara, not because of armies or agriculture, but because of salt, white gold, crystalline wealth that could be worth more than its weight in actual gold. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've ever traveled through desert country, or if you remember when salt was still a precious enough commodity that your grandmother kept it in a special container, I'd especially love to hear your stories down below. Your generation lived through history that younger folks only read about. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on a dune somewhere in what we now call Mali. Sometime around the year 1300, the sun is setting, turning the sand the color of old copper, and in the distance, you can make out shapes moving across the horizon. Not a mirage, though you've seen plenty of those. These are real. A caravan. Hundreds of camels, maybe thousands, loaded down with blocks of salt cut from the earth weeks ago, hundreds of miles to the north. Those blocks, each weighing maybe 90 pounds, represent more wealth than most people will see in their entire lives. And the men guiding these animals across this ocean of sand? They're not just traders, they're navigators, warriors, diplomats, and survivors, all rolled into one. Because crossing the Sahara wasn't like taking Route 66. It was like crossing an ocean with no landmarks, no water, and no guarantee you'd make it to the other side. Tonight, we're tracing what scholars call the Great Salt Road, though that name doesn't quite capture it. It wasn't one road. It was a network, a web of routes spanning thousands of miles, connecting the salt mines of the northern Sahara to the kingdoms of West Africa. These routes were the arteries of empires. Control them, and you controlled wealth beyond imagination. Lose them, and your kingdom withered like crops in drought. This is the story of how a mineral that we barely think about today built and destroyed civilizations, created millionaires, and shaped the course of African history for over a millennium. Before we follow the salt traders, we need to understand the stage on which this drama played out. The Sahara Desert. 3.6 million square miles of the most unforgiving real estate on Earth. For context, that's roughly the size of the entire United States. Imagine trying to cross the entire country with no roads, no gas stations, no towns, no water sources, and temperatures that could cook you during the day and freeze you at night. Now imagine doing it with 1,000 camels, carrying cargo worth a fortune, with bandits, sandstorms, and simple navigation errors waiting to kill you at every turn. The Sahara wasn't always a desert. Those of you who remember learning geography in school might recall mention of this. 10,000 years ago, this was savanna, grassland with rivers, lakes, trees, and abundant wildlife. Archaeological evidence shows us that people lived here, hunted here, raised cattle here. But climate shifts gradually turned the region arid. By the time our story begins, around the 3rd century, the Sahara had become what we recognize today: vast, hostile, and critically empty of the resources human beings need to survive. No water, no food, no shelter, just rock, sand, and sun. Yet people crossed it, not occasionally, but regularly in numbers that would astonish us. Why? Because on opposite ends of this wasteland lay things that people desperately needed, and the only way to connect them was straight through the emptiest quarter of the continent. In the north, along the Mediterranean coast, and in certain specific locations deep in the Sahara itself, there was salt. In the south, in the kingdoms of West Africa, there was gold. And in between, just death and opportunity, depending on how prepared you were. The desert wasn't uniform. It consisted of several distinct types of terrain, each with its own challenges. The erg were what most people picture when they think desert. Vast sand seas with dunes that could reach 600 feet high, constantly shifting under the wind. Traveling through erg meant navigating an ocean frozen in slow motion, where landmarks disappeared overnight and your navigation had to be perfect, or you'd simply wander until your water ran out. Then there was the Hamada, flat, rocky plateaus that stretched for hundreds of miles. Imagine walking across a parking lot for days on end. Except the parking lot is littered with sharp rocks that destroy sandals and tear up camel feet. And there's no shade, ever. The Hamada offered easier navigation than the ergs. At least the ground didn't shift, but the surfaces radiated heat like a griddle and offered zero protection from the wind. The reg were gravel plains, slightly easier going than Hamada, but still brutally exposed. And scattered throughout were isolated mountain ranges, some volcanic in origin, that could be used as landmarks, but also channeled winds into knife-sharp blasts that could strip skin. For those who served in North Africa during the war, some of this might sound familiar. The desert hasn't changed much. It's still testing human endurance the same way it did 1,000 years ago. Navigation across this landscape required extraordinary skill. There were no roads, no signs, no maps that would make sense to modern eyes. Caravan guides, usually Tuareg or other desert peoples who'd spent their entire lives learning the terrain, navigated by stars, by the shape of dunes, by the taste of sand, by the behavior of wind. They could read the desert the way a sailor reads the ocean. A slight change in the color of sand might indicate they were drifting off course. The presence of certain types of rocks meant water might be found if you knew where to dig. The flight patterns of birds, rare as they were, could lead you to an oasis you'd otherwise miss entirely. These guides were the most valuable members of any caravan, worth more than the cargo in many cases, because if your guide died, or deserted, or simply made a mistake, everyone died. The Sahara didn't offer second chances. Get lost, and you'd wander until your water ran out, which, in summer heat, might be 3 days, maybe 4 if you were lucky, and rationed carefully. Your bones would bleach in the sun alongside thousands of others who'd made similar errors in judgment over the centuries. Now, before we go further, we need to answer the obvious question: why salt? What made this mineral, which we can buy for $1 at any grocery store, valuable enough to build empires on? The answer isn't simple, and it's not just about making food taste better, though that was part of it. In the arid regions of West Africa, salt wasn't just desirable. It was physiologically necessary for survival, and it was desperately scarce. Human beings need salt. We lose it through sweat, and in the intense heat of sub-Saharan Africa, people sweat constantly. Without salt replacement, you develop muscle cramps, weakness, mental confusion, and eventually, death. It's not a pleasant way to go. Your body simply stops functioning. For modern Americans, this isn't an issue. We actually consume too much salt. It's in everything we eat. But in medieval West Africa, getting adequate salt was a constant struggle. The region had almost no natural salt deposits. The coastal areas had some access through sea salt production, but inland, hundreds of miles from the ocean, nothing. People had to obtain salt through trade, or they suffered. Beyond physiological necessity, salt was essential for food preservation in an era before refrigeration. And for those who remember ice boxes and root cellars, you'll appreciate this. Salt was how you kept meat from rotting in tropical heat. Pack meat in salt, and it would last for months instead of hours. For societies that raised cattle and goats, this was the difference between prosperity and starvation. You could slaughter an animal and actually use all of it, rather than racing to consume it before it spoiled. Salt meant you could build up food reserves. It meant you could trade meat and fish over long distances. It fundamentally changed what was possible economically. Salt also had medicinal applications, was used in leather tanning, and held religious and ritual significance in many West African cultures. It was a prestige good displaying. Salt at a feast showed wealth and status. It was sometimes used as currency in areas where metal coins were scarce. In short, salt was woven into every aspect of life, and people who couldn't get it suffered accordingly. The scarcity drove prices to extraordinary heights. In some markets in medieval West Africa, salt traded ounce for ounce with gold. Think about that. Gold, which required tremendous labor to mine and process, was considered equal in value to salt, which required roughly the same effort to extract, but was infinitely more useful in daily life. Some sources suggest that during periods of particular scarcity, salt could command even higher prices. A pound of salt might buy you a slave, a horse, or enough grain to feed a family for months. So, where did this valuable commodity come from? Several locations in and around the Sahara produced salt, but a few dominated the trade. The most famous was Tagaza, located in what's now northern Mali. Tagaza wasn't a city. It wasn't really even a town. It was hell with a gift shop. Imagine the most desolate place you've ever seen, then remove any redeeming features it might have had. That was Tagaza. It was literally in the middle of nowhere, roughly 450 miles north of Timbuktu, and equally far from anything else worth mentioning. The only reason anyone went there was salt. The salt deposits at Tagaza lay beneath the surface in thick layers, some of them several feet deep. Miners, and when I say miners, I mean enslaved laborers, because nobody did this work voluntarily, would excavate these deposits by cutting them into blocks. The blocks were typically 3 feet by 2 feet by half a foot thick, weighing around 90 pounds each. The work was brutal. The temperature could reach well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, the sun reflecting off white salt in every direction until you couldn't open your eyes without pain. At night, it could drop to near freezing. There was no fresh water at Tagaza. Water had to be brought in by caravan from distant wells. There was no food. Everything had to be imported. The miners lived in houses built from salt blocks, not because this was a good building material, but because there was literally nothing else available. No wood, no stone, just salt. When it rained, which was rare but not unknown, these houses partially dissolved. Imagine that, your walls melting in the rain. The few descriptions we have of Tagaza from medieval travelers paint it as one of the most miserable places on earth. And these were people who'd crossed the Sahara, so their standards for miserable were already fairly high. Yet the salt had to be extracted because the demand and the profit margins were simply too enormous to ignore. The miners worked under armed supervision, cutting blocks from dawn until it became too hot to continue, then resuming in late afternoon until dark. Each block represented wealth, but not for the men cutting it. They were paid, if you can call it that, in dates and water. The real money went to the merchants who owned the mining rights and organized the caravan south. Before we follow the caravan south, we need to talk about the animal that made all of this possible, the dromedary camel. Without this creature, the trans-Saharan trade would never have existed. Oh, there were attempts before camels were widely adopted. People tried using oxen, horses, and human porters. All failed spectacularly. The Sahara was simply too harsh, too waterless, too vast. Then camels arrived, and suddenly, the impossible became merely extraordinarily difficult. The dromedary, the single-humped variety native to Arabia and North Africa, is an engineering marvel produced by evolution for one specific purpose: not dying in deserts. Everything about this animal is optimized for surviving in conditions that would kill a horse in days and a human in hours. Let's go through the features, because they're genuinely impressive. First, water conservation. A camel can lose up to 25% of its body weight through dehydration and not only survive, but keep functioning. For reference, humans start experiencing severe problems at about 10% dehydration, and anything above 15% is usually fatal. A camel hits 25% and keeps walking. When it finally does find water, it can drink 30 gallons, that's 240 pounds, in about 10 minutes. Its body absorbs and distributes this water so efficiently that it doesn't need to drink again for days or even weeks, depending on conditions. The hump, contrary to popular belief, doesn't store water. It stores fat, up to 80 pounds of it. When food is scarce, the camel metabolizes this fat for energy. The reason this matters for desert survival is that storing fat in one localized area rather than distributed across the body allows the rest of the animal to radiate heat more efficiently. It's actually quite clever design, though obviously nobody designed it. Evolution just killed off all the camels with evenly distributed body fat because they overheated. The feet are perhaps the most important feature for desert travel. Camels have broad, padded feet that spread their weight across a large surface area. This prevents them from sinking into soft sand the way a horse's hooves would. Those who've tried walking on a beach, especially loose, dry sand, know how exhausting it is to constantly sink with every step. Camels can walk on top of that sand for hours without significant effort. Their eyes have 3 eyelids, including one that's translucent and can be closed to protect against blowing sand, while still allowing the animal to see. The nostrils can be closed to keep out sand during storms. The lips are tough enough to eat thorny desert plants that would shred a horse's mouth. And perhaps most importantly for caravan work, they can carry tremendous loads. A healthy camel can bear 400 to 600 pounds of cargo and walk 25 to 30 miles per day while doing it, day after day, for weeks on end. Of course, these remarkable abilities came with certain trade-offs. Camels are, to put it mildly, not pleasant animals to work with. They're temperamental. They spit when annoyed. They bite. They kick. And they make sounds that range from annoying groaning to unholy bellowing that sounds like someone torturing a foghorn. Loading a camel is a negotiation that can turn into a fight without warning. They hold grudges. They apparently remember people who've mistreated them and will wait months or even years for an opportunity for revenge. There are documented cases of camels killing handlers who'd beaten them years earlier. But for crossing the Sahara, you used camels or you died trying. It was that simple. The introduction of camels to North Africa sometime around the 3rd or 4th century made the trans-Saharan trade possible on a large scale. Before camels, trade between North Africa and West Africa was limited to the Sahel, the southern edge of the desert, where it transitions to savanna. With camels, merchants could cut straight across the heart of the Sahara, reducing journey times and opening up entirely new routes and markets. Now that we understand the landscape and the technology, let's talk about how these caravans actually functioned. Because organizing a trans-Saharan trading expedition wasn't like loading up a truck and hitting the interstate. This was closer to mounting a military campaign, with logistics that would challenge a modern quartermaster. A major salt caravan could include anywhere from 1,000 to 12,000 camels. Yes, 12,000. Picture a line of camels so long you literally couldn't see from one end to the other, all tied together, all moving at walking pace across terrain, with no roads, no landmarks, no infrastructure of any kind. The coordination required was extraordinary. Planning began months in advance. Merchants in cities like Timbuktu, Jenne, or Gao would form consortiums, pooling resources to finance the expedition. They'd hire a caravan master, an experienced desert traveler who knew the routes, the wells, the dangers, and had connections with the desert peoples whose territory they'd be crossing. This man was absolutely crucial. His decisions would determine whether the caravan succeeded or ended up as another collection of bleached bones, marking a bad choice. They'd recruit the necessary personnel, camel handlers, guards, because bandits were a constant threat, skilled navigators, specialists in reading weather and finding water, cooks, and general laborers. A caravan of several thousand camels might require 300 to 400 men to manage. Each man had to be equipped, paid, and fed for the entire journey, which could last 3 to 4 months one way. That's 6 to 8 months round trip. You're looking at the better part of a year away from home, much of it spent crossing the most hostile environment imaginable. Water was the critical constraint. Every single drop had to be carried or found along the way. The main trade routes were determined not by shortest distance, but by the locations of wells and oases. These water sources were spaced anywhere from 3 to 10 days travel apart, which meant the caravan had to carry enough water to survive the gap between them. But water is heavy, very heavy. A gallon weighs 8 pounds. If you've got 400 men and 1,000 camels, the water requirements are astronomical. So the caravans traveled during the cooler months, typically October through April in most regions, when water consumption was lower. They'd also travel at night, when possible, resting during the hottest part of the day. This wasn't for comfort. It was survival mathematics. A man active during the day in full sun might need 2 gallons of water or more. The same man active at night might need half that. When you're multiplying these numbers by hundreds of people and thousands of animals across thousands of miles, these differences become life and death calculations. The wells themselves were crucial infrastructure maintained by local populations who often charged fees for their use. Some wells were shallow, maybe 10 or 20 feet, easy to access. Others were deep, 100 feet or more, requiring elaborate rope and pulley systems to bring water to the surface. Drawing enough water for a caravan of thousands could take an entire day. The people who controlled these wells controlled the trade routes. They could charge whatever they wanted, because what were you going to do? Die of thirst in protest? Some wells were brackish, barely drinkable, but better than nothing. Others produced good water, which was worth almost as much as the salt being transported. And some wells that had been reliable for decades could suddenly run dry, especially if multiple large caravans used them in succession without allowing time for recharge. A dried well could doom a caravan, especially if it was in the middle of a long stretch between other water sources. Navigation was the other critical challenge. How do you guide several thousand camels across unmarked desert to find a well you can't see until you're practically on top of it? The caravan master relied on guides, usually Tuareg or other desert peoples, who'd spent their entire lives learning the routes. These men navigated by stars. Obviously, the night sky was their primary reference, but they also read the ground, the rocks, the sand, even the taste of the soil. They knew that certain colored rocks indicated you were approaching a particular range of hills. They knew that particular shapes of dune meant the wind patterns had shifted, which told them where they were relative to known landmarks. They knew that the presence of certain types of dried vegetation meant water was close, at least by desert standards. These guides were paid extraordinary sums because they were worth it. A skilled navigator could mean the difference between reaching Tagaza in 40 days or wandering lost until everyone died. There are accounts of caravans that lost their guides through death, desertion, or simply getting separated during a sandstorm. And the results were predictably catastrophic. Without the guide, even experienced caravan masters were essentially guessing. And in the Sahara, guesses get you killed. The pace of travel was slow by our standards, but impressive given the circumstances. A laden camel walks at about 2.5 miles per hour. Factor in rest stops, well visits, and navigation corrections, and you're looking at 15 to 25 miles per day under good conditions. The journey from Timbuktu to Tagaza was roughly 450 miles, so you're talking about a minimum of 20 days, more likely 30 to 40 when you account for everything that could slow you down. And that was considered one of the shorter major routes. Some caravans traveled twice that distance or more. Security was a constant concern. The valuable cargo made caravans targets for raiders, other desert peoples who'd rather steal salt than buy it, or bandits who specialized in hitting caravans at vulnerable points along the route. Guards were essential, usually armed with spears, swords, and bows. But there was a limit to how much protection you could provide when your convoy stretched for miles and moved at walking pace through open terrain. If raiders wanted to hit you, they probably could. The deterrent was partly the guards, but mostly the size of the caravan itself. Attacking several thousand camels guarded by hundreds of armed men required significant force. Natural hazards outnumbered human threats. Sandstorms could strike with little warning, reducing visibility to zero and making navigation impossible. The caravan would halt, camels would be made to sit in tight groups for shelter, and everyone would wrap their faces and wait it out. These storms could last hours or days. When they passed, you'd have to dig out equipment, reestablish your bearings, and hope you hadn't drifted too far off course. Temperature swings were extreme. Daytime temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, hot enough to cause lethal heat stroke in hours. Nighttime temperatures in winter could drop below freezing. Your body had to cope with a 70 or 80 degree temperature swing within 24 hours, while remaining active, drinking limited water, and eating minimal food. It's not an experience the human body particularly enjoys. And then there was simple physical exhaustion. Walking 20 miles a day, day after day, for weeks on end, in heat and cold, on limited food and water, while managing difficult animals and carrying gear, breaks down even strong men. The caravan would lose people, some to illness, some to accident, some just to giving up. Those who couldn't continue would be left at wells or oases if possible, with hope that they'd recover and catch a caravan heading back. If you had to be left in the middle of nowhere, well, we've already discussed what happens to people alone in the Sahara. Those of you who've done extended time in harsh conditions, military service in difficult terrain for instance, might have some appreciation for what these men endured. But even modern military operations have supply lines, medical support, extraction possibilities. These caravans had none of that. Once you left the last settlement, you were committed. The only way out was through, and through meant weeks of suffering before you reached the other side. After weeks of suffering across the Sahara, imagine the relief of seeing Timbuktu's walls rise from the horizon. For northbound caravans carrying salt from Tagaza, Timbuktu was the first major destination, the place where salt transformed from heavy cargo to liquid wealth. For those who've never heard the full story, Timbuktu wasn't just a remote outpost. At its height, In the 14th and 15th centuries, it was one of the wealthiest cities on earth, a center of learning, commerce, and culture that rivaled anything in Europe or the Middle East, and it all ran on salt. Timbuktu's location was deliberate and perfect. It sat at the northern bend of the Niger River, where the Sahara and the Sahel meet, where desert caravans and river trade intersected. To the north lay the routes to Tagaza, and beyond to the Mediterranean. To the south, the Niger River provided transportation deep into gold-producing regions. Timbuktu was the pivot point where salt from the north met gold from the south, and the merchants who controlled this exchange became spectacularly rich. The city's markets were extraordinary by any standard. Arab travelers who visited Timbuktu in medieval times left detailed descriptions that sound almost mythical. One of the most famous was Ibn Battuta, a Moroccan scholar who traveled there in 1353. He described markets where salt, gold, copper, textiles, slaves, books, and exotic goods from across Africa and the Mediterranean were bought and sold daily. The volume of trade was staggering. A single caravan arriving from Tagaza might carry several thousand camel loads of salt. We're talking millions of pounds, all of which would be sold within days. The economic system was sophisticated. Salt arriving from Tagaza would be assessed for quality. Different salt deposits produced different grades, with the clearest, whitest salt commanding premium prices. It would then be divided into smaller units for retail sale or kept in large blocks for wholesale trade. Merchants used a complex credit system involving promissory notes and partnerships that allowed them to move large sums without physically carrying gold or cowrie shells. It was essentially medieval banking, and it worked remarkably well. The city itself reflected this wealth. The famous Sankor Mosque, parts of which still stand today, was built with elaborate decorations and served not just as a place of worship, but as a center of learning. Timbuktu's libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering subjects from astronomy to medicine to poetry. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to study there. This wasn't some backwater. This was a major intellectual center, and it was funded by salt profits. But Timbuktu wasn't alone. Jenne, located further south on the Niger, was another crucial trading city. Jenne specialized in the exchange of salt for agricultural products and gold from even further south. The city's great mosque, still standing and still remarkable, is made entirely from mud brick in the Sudano-Sahelian style, with those distinctive wooden beams protruding from the walls. It's rebuilt every year during the rainy season, a community effort that's continued for centuries. That kind of social cohesion and wealth allowed for architectural achievements that still impress today. Gao, capital of the Songhai Empire at its height, was another major terminus. Located even further down the Niger, Gao controlled trade routes extending deep into the forest regions where gold was mined and ivory harvested. Salt arriving in Gao might continue southward by river for hundreds more miles, exchanged and re-exchanged through multiple hands before reaching its final consumer. Each transaction added value and took a cut, creating a whole chain of middlemen who prospered on the salt trade. These cities developed specialized merchant classes who did nothing but organize caravans and manage trade. These weren't small-time operators. We're talking about individuals who might own 1,000 camels, employ hundreds of men, maintain agents in multiple cities, and command credit equivalent to millions of dollars in modern terms. The wealthiest merchants built compounds with multiple buildings, employed large households, and lived in luxury that would be recognizable to anyone today as serious money. The social impact was equally significant. Cities like Timbuktu and Djenné became cosmopolitan, attracting people from across Africa and the Mediterranean. You'd find Berbers from North Africa, Arabs from Egypt and Arabia, Tuareg from the deep desert, Mandinka and Songhai from West Africa, and dozens of other ethnic groups, all living and trading together. This forced a level of tolerance and cultural exchange that was actually quite remarkable for the medieval period. Yes, there were conflicts and prejudices. Human nature didn't change, but the economic incentives for cooperation were strong enough that these cities functioned as truly multi-ethnic trading hubs for centuries. Now, controlling cities where salt was traded was valuable, but controlling the routes themselves, controlling the salt sources, controlling the whole system from mine to market, that built empires. Let's talk about 3 successive West African empires that rose to power largely on the salt trade: Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These weren't minor kingdoms. At their peaks, they controlled territories larger than Western Europe and commanded resources that made them major powers by any global standard. The Ghana Empire, not located in modern Ghana, but rather in what's now Mauritania and Mali, was the earliest to dominate trans-Saharan trade. Ghana rose to prominence around the 8th century and controlled key routes between the salt mines of the north and the gold fields of the south. The kings of Ghana didn't mine gold or salt themselves. They taxed it. Every camel load of salt entering their territory paid a tax. Every ounce of gold leaving paid another tax. If you wanted to trade through Ghana's territory, you paid for the privilege. And since the most profitable routes ran through Ghana's domain, traders paid. The revenue was enormous. Arab historians writing about Ghana describe the king's court as displaying wealth beyond comprehension. The king reportedly had a nugget of gold so large it took multiple men to lift it, used as a hitching post for his horse. Whether that particular detail is true or exaggerated doesn't really matter. The fact that foreign visitors believed such wealth was plausible tells you everything about Ghana's prosperity. The kingdom maintained a professional army estimated at 200,000 men, which is a staggering number for the medieval period. Those soldiers were equipped, fed, and paid from salt and gold taxes. Ghana's control lasted until the 11th century, when the empire fragmented under pressure from multiple directions, including the Almoravid invasion from the north and internal succession disputes. But the model was proven. Control the trade, control the wealth, control the region. The next empire to consolidate that control would be even more impressive. The Mali Empire emerged in the 13th century under Sundiata Keita, and it took everything Ghana had done and expanded it. Mali controlled even more territory, more trade routes, and more salt sources. At its peak in the 14th century, under Mansa Musa, probably the most famous West African ruler in history, Mali was genuinely one of the wealthiest states in the world. And the foundation of that wealth was, again, salt. Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 has become legendary. He traveled with an entourage estimated at 60,000 people, including 12,000 personal slaves. He brought so much gold on this journey that his spending in Cairo actually caused inflation in the Egyptian economy. He literally devalued gold by flooding the market. Where did that gold come from? The Mali Empire's control of the gold-salt exchange. Gold flowed north, salt flowed south, and the Malian kings took their cut of every transaction. Those who studied world history in school might remember learning about Mansa Musa. What often gets left out is that his display of wealth wasn't just personal extravagance. It was a calculated political statement. He was demonstrating to the Islamic world that Mali was a major power that commanded respect. And it worked. After his pilgrimage, Mali's reputation spread throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East. European maps began showing Mali prominently, often with Mansa Musa depicted holding a gold nugget. That kind of soft power, built on hard economic reality, translated into diplomatic influence and trading privileges. Mali also invested heavily in infrastructure. The empire maintained way stations along major caravan routes, ensured wells were maintained and protected, and provided security against bandits. This might sound like basic government function, but in the medieval world, providing reliable, safe conditions for long-distance trade was actually quite unusual. Most regions were fragmented into small territories where travelers might be robbed by local lords as easily as by bandits. Mali's ability to provide secure passage across thousands of miles was a major competitive advantage that attracted trade to their routes instead of competing paths. The empire's control of Timbuktu and other major trading cities also meant control over intellectual production. Mali's kings were patrons of scholarship, funding the copying of manuscripts, supporting scholars, and building libraries. This wasn't just cultural vanity, it served practical purposes. Legal scholarship, established trade regulations, scientific knowledge, improved navigation and agriculture. Religious scholarship legitimized the ruler's authority. The salt trade funded an intellectual flowering that produced works still studied today. Mali's dominance lasted into the 15th century, but like all empires, it eventually weakened. Internal succession disputes, the difficulty of controlling such vast territory, and pressure from emerging rivals gradually eroded central authority. The Songhai Empire, initially a vassal state of Mali, broke away and became the next dominant power in the region. Songhai, under leaders like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, expanded even further than Mali, controlling territory from the Atlantic Ocean to what's now northern Nigeria. Songhai's approach was slightly different. They emphasized military control and direct administration rather than Mali's more decentralized system. Askia Muhammad reorganized the government along Islamic legal principles, standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade, and established a complex tax system that extracted revenue more efficiently than his predecessors. Songhai controlled Tagaza directly through military force, which was unusual. Most empires had negotiated arrangements with the mining operations. Askia Muhammad essentially said, "This is ours now," and stationed troops to ensure compliance. This gave Songhai more direct control over salt production and prices, which translated to even higher profits, but also required military expenditure to maintain that control. It was a gamble that paid off during Songhai's peak, but contributed to overextension that would eventually weaken them. These three empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, collectively dominated West African trade for nearly 1,000 years, from roughly the 8th century through the 16th. Their power was built on a simple principle: control the exchange between salt and gold, control the caravan routes that connected them, and tax every transaction. It's worth noting that this wasn't unique to Africa. Throughout history, empires have risen by controlling trade choke points. Venice with Mediterranean trade, various Chinese dynasties with the Silk Road, the Ottomans with roots between Europe and Asia. The Ghana-Mali-Songhai succession was the African version of this universal pattern. If you're wondering why you didn't learn more about these empires in school, well, that's a longer conversation about whose history gets taught and whose gets overlooked. But these were major, sophisticated states that would have been fully recognizable to their European contemporaries as legitimate powers. The difference in historical attention says more about later European biases than about the actual importance of these kingdoms. We've talked about empires and economics, cities and trade volumes, but the salt trade was ultimately about people, individuals making the brutal journey across the Sahara because they had no choice or because the potential profit outweighed the very real possibility of death. Let's talk about what this actually meant at the human level. Consider a salt miner at Tagaza. His name is lost to history, so let's call him Musa, which was common enough. Musa probably didn't choose this work. Most salt miners were slaves, captured in raids or sold by their families during famines. He wakes before dawn in his salt block house that partially melts in the rare rain. The only food is dates and millet brought in by caravan at prices he can never afford. His payment is subsistence rations that keep him just alive enough to work. His hands are ruined, cracked and bleeding from constant contact with salt. His eyes ache from sun reflecting off white surfaces in every direction. He'll spend today doing what he did yesterday and will do tomorrow, cutting blocks of salt from the mine face. The work is brutally simple, but physically destroying. You use an iron wedge and wooden mallet to split the salt along natural fracture lines. Then lever out blocks that weigh 90 pounds each. You do this hundreds of times a day. The salt dust gets everywhere, in your lungs, your eyes, every fold of your skin. It stings in your wounds. It makes you perpetually thirsty, which is a special torture when water is strictly rationed. Musa might survive 5 years at this work if he's lucky. More likely, 2 or 3. The combination of physical exhaustion, inadequate food, harsh climate, and respiratory problems from salt dust kills most miners before they reach 30. When he dies, he'll be buried in the salt he spent his life extracting, and another slave will take his place. His contribution to history is the salt blocks that built empires and made merchants wealthy. He'll never see the cities where his salt is sold, never taste the prestige foods it makes possible, never benefit from the intellectual achievements it funds. Now consider a merchant. someone at the opposite end of the economic spectrum. Let's call him Ahmed, a Berber trader from Sijil Massa, a Moroccan city that was a major northern terminus. Ahmed has invested heavily in this caravan. 200 camels, cargo of dates and brass goods heading south, with plans to return with salt and gold. He's 40 years old, has made this journey 8 times before, and has become wealthy enough to invest serious capital in each expedition. But Ahmed knows the risks intimately. His brother died on his 3rd crossing, lost in a sandstorm. 2 caravans ago, Ahmed himself narrowly survived when their guide miscalculated the distance to a well and water ran critically low. He's seen men die of thirst, seen camels collapse and be left behind, seen entire caravans wiped out by raiders. Each journey is a calculated risk where he's betting his capital and literally his life on reaching the other side. If this caravan succeeds, Ahmed will double or triple his investment. That profit will feed his extended family, maintain his household, and fund his next expedition. It will also support the mosque he's helping build in Sijil Massa, enhance his social status, and potentially secure better marriage arrangements for his children. But if the caravan fails, if they lose too many camels, if the market prices have crashed by the time they arrive, if raiders take the cargo, Ahmed could be ruined financially. And if he dies on the journey, his family's security disappears with him. The psychological toll of these journeys was real. Imagine spending 3 months crossing a landscape that's actively trying to kill you, responsible for dozens of men and hundreds of animals, knowing that any mistake could doom everyone. Ahmed doesn't sleep well during these crossings. He's constantly checking the navigation, the water supplies, the health of the animals, the morale of the men. He's watching the horizon for signs of storms or raiders. Every day that passes without disaster is a relief, but it brings you no closer to safety. You just have more days to get through before reaching the other side. Then there are the camel handlers, the ordinary men who make up the majority of any caravan. These are working men, hired for their skills with camels and their physical toughness. They're paid a wage, not generous, but honest. And many do this work repeatedly because the alternatives are subsistence farming or urban poverty. The work is brutal, but it pays better than most options available to them. A typical handler might be responsible for 15 to 20 camels. He loads them, maintains their health, keeps them moving, settles disputes when camels fight, and they do, treats their wounds and sicknesses with whatever limited remedies are available, and coaxes them forward when they don't want to move. It's skilled work. A bad handler can ruin valuable animals through neglect or improper loading. A good handler keeps his charges healthy and productive even under terrible conditions. These men develop relationships with their animals, not affection exactly. Camels aren't really lovable, but a kind of professional respect and understanding. You learn each animal's personality, its quirks, its limits. You know that this one will bite if you approach from the left. That one will try to kick during loading. This one is reliable and steady. That one is temperamental but strong. After months on the trail together, you know these animals better than you know your own siblings. The handlers face all the same dangers as everyone else. thirst, heat, cold, storms, raiders, accidents, but with less ability to control their fate. If the caravan master makes a navigation error, the handlers die alongside everyone else, but they have no say in the decisions. If the merchant cuts rations too thin to maximize profit, the handlers suffer. If the guide gets lost, the handlers can't fix it. They're along for the ride, literally, and their survival depends on other people's competence and good faith. And then there's the women, who are largely invisible in historical accounts, but were crucial to the whole system. Women in the trading cities managed households, maintained family businesses during their husbands' months-long absences, negotiated local trade, and raised children who often didn't know their fathers for half of each year. In some cases, women were traders themselves, particularly in urban markets where they controlled retail trade in certain goods. The wife of a caravan merchant lived a strange life. For months at a time, she'd be essentially a single parent, managing everything from finances to family disputes to property maintenance. Then her husband would return, if he returned, and she'd have to reintegrate him into household routines that had functioned without him. The stress of never knowing if this would be the journey that didn't come back must have been considerable. Women built their lives around these absences, created support networks with other merchants' families, and developed their own forms of resilience. For those who remember loved ones going off to war for extended periods, Korea, Vietnam, deployment cycles and more recent conflicts, some of this might resonate. That constant background anxiety, the not knowing, the trying to carry on normal life while someone you care about is in danger. The salt trade wasn't warfare, but the mortality rates weren't dramatically different. A significant percentage of men who crossed the Sahara regularly didn't live to old age. Salt and gold were the cargo, but they weren't the only things traveling these routes. Ideas moved across the Sahara as surely as goods. Religious beliefs, technological knowledge, artistic styles, political concepts, and even diseases traveled with the caravans, carried by merchants, scholars, and slaves, transforming both ends of the trade network in ways that would last centuries. The most obvious cultural exchange was religious. Islam spread across the Sahara primarily through trade networks. Merchants brought the faith with them, and its appeal to trading communities was strong. Islam offered a common legal framework for contracts and disputes, which made business between different ethnic groups more practical. It provided a shared language in Arabic, which facilitated record keeping and communication, and it created a network of trust. Muslim merchants could rely on other Muslims in distant cities to honor agreements and provide support. By the 11th century, the ruling classes of major West African kingdoms were converting to Islam, though often maintaining traditional practices alongside the new religion. The Ghana Empire's rulers remained traditional in their personal beliefs, but allowed Muslims to practice freely because the economic benefits were too valuable to ignore. Mali's rulers were more thoroughly Islamic. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim whose pilgrimage to Mecca was a genuine religious obligation, as well as a political statement. Songhai under Askia Muhammad implemented Islamic law throughout the empire. This religious transformation wasn't entirely organic or peaceful. There were tensions between traditional religions and Islam, between those who converted for economic advantage and those who genuinely believed. But the salt trade created incentives for conversion that gradually transformed West African society. By the 16th century, major urban centers were predominantly Islamic, though rural areas often maintained traditional practices. Scholarship traveled the same routes. Arabic texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy made their way to Timbuktu and other West African cities. Local scholars studied these works, copied them, wrote commentaries, and sometimes produced original contributions. Timbuktu's libraries at their height contain between 300,000 to 1 million manuscripts, an extraordinary number. For context, major European libraries of the same period might have a few thousand volumes. This wasn't just passive reception of ideas from elsewhere. West African scholars contributed to Islamic intellectual tradition, producing original works on Quranic interpretation, legal theory, and local history. The Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatash, chronicles written in 17th century Timbuktu, are our primary sources for much of West African medieval history. Without these works, compiled by local scholars, we'd know far less about the empires and events we've been discussing tonight. Mathematical knowledge moved in both directions. Arabic numerals, actually developed in India but transmitted through the Islamic world, reached West Africa via the salt routes. At the same time, certain West African mathematical traditions related to textile patterns and architectural design influenced Islamic art. The distinctive geometric patterns in Sudano-Sahelian architecture show this cultural synthesis. Islamic geometric principles applied through local materials and techniques. Technological transfer was equally significant. Metallurgy techniques, agricultural methods, architectural innovations, and military technology all spread via trade routes. West African smiths learned new techniques for working iron and brass from North African and Middle Eastern craftsmen. In return, West African innovations in textiles, particularly the sophisticated weaving traditions of the region, influenced North African fashion. The iconic indigo-dyed cloth associated with Tuareg culture originated from West African dyeing techniques. Medicine is another area where exchange was active. North African and Arab medical texts based on Greek and Persian traditions reached West African cities. At the same time, West African medicinal knowledge, particularly regarding tropical diseases unknown in North Africa, traveled northward. Healers in Timbuktu might treat a patient using both Islamic medical theory from a translated text and local herbal remedies passed down through generations. This synthesis saved lives and advanced medical knowledge on both sides. Cuisine changed through contact. North African dishes incorporated ingredients from West Africa, while West African cooking adopted spices and preparation methods from the north. Tea drinking, which is now strongly associated with Tuareg and West African culture, was introduced through these trade networks. Couscous, which originated in North Africa, became incorporated into West African diets in regions with strong trading connections. Food is culture, and these culinary exchanges reflected deeper cultural integration. Even diseases traveled the routes. Though this is a darker aspect of the exchange, epidemics moved with caravans, sometimes devastating populations on arrival. The Black Death, which struck North Africa in the 14th century, likely reached some West African cities via trade routes, though the impact was less severe than in more densely populated regions to the north. In the other direction, tropical diseases endemic to West Africa occasionally traveled north with caravans, though the desert acted as a barrier that killed most disease vectors. Those who studied history know that trade routes have always been vectors for both beneficial and harmful exchange. The Silk Road spread Buddhism, paper, and gunpowder, but also plague. The Columbian Exchange transformed global cuisine and agriculture, but also triggered demographic catastrophes. The Salt Road was no different. The same networks that spread Islamic scholarship and medical knowledge also spread disease and facilitated the slave trade. History rarely deals in pure goods or pure evils. We've talked about salt flowing south and gold flowing north, but we haven't really explained how the economics worked at a technical level, because this wasn't simple barter. The salt trade involves sophisticated financial instruments, credit systems, partnership arrangements, and market mechanisms that would be recognizable to any modern economist. Let's break down how value was actually created and transferred. Start with the basic value chain. Salt extracted at Tagaza had a production cost that included the initial capital investment in mining rights, the cost of enslaved labor, either purchase price or capture costs, tools and equipment, and the logistical cost of supplying the mining operation with food and water. A rough estimate suggests a 90-pound salt block might have a production cost equivalent to about a day's wages for a skilled laborer in Timbuktu. Transport added substantial cost. Camel purchase or rental, handler wages, guide fees, food and water for the journey, taxes and tribute to territories crossed, protective escorts against bandits, all these had to be factored in. By the time that salt block reached Timbuktu, its cost had roughly tripled from the minehead price. This transportation markup was where caravan masters made their profit, assuming they successfully completed the journey. Once in Timbuktu, the salt entered a competitive market with other salt from different mines, with varying quality grades commanding different prices. A block of pure white salt from Tagaza's best deposits might sell for 4 to 5 times the price of lower-grade grayish salt from lesser mines. Merchants specialized in knowing these quality distinctions and targeting their cargo to specific market segments. The retail markup was significant. Once a merchant in Timbuktu bought wholesale salt, he might break the large blocks into smaller pieces for retail sale, further increasing the price per pound. By the time salt reached a consumer in the interior regions, its price might be 6 to 10 times the minehead cost. For particularly remote areas, the markup could be even higher. This is where the worth its weight in gold comparisons come from. In areas far from trade routes, where salt was desperately scarce, prices could reach extraordinary levels. Now, here's where it gets sophisticated. Most merchants didn't operate with pure capital. They used credit extensively. A merchant might borrow funds to outfit a caravan, with repayment due when the caravan returned. The lenders, often wealthy established merchants or wealthy families, would take a percentage of profits as interest, sometimes as high as 20 or 30%, for a single journey. Given the risks involved, these interest rates weren't unreasonable. The lender was essentially betting that the merchant would survive and succeed. Knowing full well that a significant percentage of caravans suffered major losses or failed entirely, partnership arrangements were common. Multiple merchants might pool resources for a single caravan, sharing both risks and profits. This allowed smaller merchants to participate in long-distance trade without having the capital to outfit an entire caravan themselves. A typical partnership contract would specify each partner's contribution, their percentage of the profits, how losses would be allocated, and what would happen if partners died during the journey. These contracts were often written, witnessed, and enforceable through Islamic legal courts. Factors: commercial agents who operated in distant cities were crucial to the system. A merchant in Sijil Masa might have a factor in Timbuktu who would receive his goods, sell them on commission, purchase return cargo, and manage all the local negotiations. The factor took a percentage of the transaction value for his services. This allowed merchants to participate in distant markets without having to personally travel to each city, spreading their risk and allowing them to operate in multiple markets simultaneously. Insurance wasn't formally developed in the modern sense, but risk-spreading arrangements served similar functions. A merchant might send small amounts of cargo on multiple caravans rather than putting everything on a single journey. If one caravan failed, the others might succeed. Wealthy merchants also diversified across different trade goods. Salt one season, gold and ivory the next, textiles and luxury goods after that. This prevented any single market collapse from ruining them. Currency itself was complex. In some regions, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean served as small denomination currency. In others, copper rods or brass rings functioned as money. Gold dust and nuggets served as high-value currency. Salt itself was often accepted as payment, especially in regions where it was scarce. This multiplicity of currency types required money changers who specialized in exchange rates between different forms of value. These changers operated much like modern currency exchanges, taking a commission on each transaction. Taxation was substantial and came in multiple forms. Export and import duties at city gates, transit fees for passing through territorial boundaries, market taxes on transactions, and special levies on luxury goods all took their cut. A block of salt traveling from Tagaza to a consumer deep in the forest regions might pass through 5 or 6 different tax jurisdictions, each taking a percentage. These taxes weren't minor. They could add 30 to 50% to the final price. Yet the system worked for centuries. Why? Because everyone along the chain, even those paying heavy taxes, still made money. The fundamental reality was that salt in West Africa and gold in North Africa were so valuable relative to their costs in their regions of origin that enormous markups and tax extractions could occur without making the trade unprofitable. The margin was simply that large. This is worth reflecting on. The distance, the danger, the logistical complexity, the multiple layers of taxation, the credit costs, the mortality rates, all of this could be absorbed because the underlying demand for salt in the south and gold in the north was so strong and the supply so constrained. The Sahara wasn't an obstacle that prevented trade. It was a barrier that made trade profitable by keeping supply limited. If there had been an easy way to transport salt to West Africa, the price differential would have collapsed and the trade wouldn't have been worth the effort. The very difficulty of the journey is what created the profit margins that made empires rich. Those who remember economics courses might recognize this as a classic case of geographic arbitrage, buying something where it's cheap and selling where it's expensive, with the profit deriving from the transportation and risk. In modern global markets, these arbitrage opportunities rarely last long because capital floods in to exploit them. But in the medieval world, the capital requirements, specialized knowledge, and extreme risks kept the number of participants limited, allowing the profit margins to persist for centuries. The trans-Saharan salt trade reached its peak in the 15th century under the Songhai Empire. Caravans were larger, more frequent, and more profitable than ever before. Cities like Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao prospered as never before. And then, gradually but inexorably, everything began to change. The cause came from an unexpected direction, not from the desert, but from the sea. Portuguese explorers, pushing down the West African coast in their caravels, reached the Gulf of Guinea in the 1440s and 50s. What they found there would eventually undermine 1,000 years of trans-Saharan commerce. They found gold. The same gold that had been traveling north across the Sahara was available directly from coastal sources, without the need to negotiate with Saharan kingdoms or risk the desert crossing. For the Portuguese, this was extraordinary news. They could purchase gold directly from coastal peoples, load it on ships, and sail it back to Lisbon. The journey was faster, safer, and cheaper than the overland route. A ship could carry cargo equivalent to hundreds of camels and make the journey in weeks rather than months. The economics were devastating to the overland trade. Why would a merchant risk the Sahara when he could ship by sea? Initially, the impact was gradual. The Portuguese presence was limited, and they didn't immediately disrupt established trade patterns. The trans-Saharan trade continued strong through the end of the 15th century, but the precedent was established. European powers had discovered they could access West African wealth directly via maritime routes, bypassing the Saharan kingdoms entirely. The 16th century saw this competition intensify. More European powers, the Dutch, the English, the French, established coastal trading posts. They weren't just buying gold, they were selling goods, textiles, metalwork, weapons that competed with items traditionally traded across the Sahara. Coastal African communities suddenly had alternative trading partners and alternative sources for goods they'd previously obtained through trans-Saharan intermediaries. The salt trade itself faced new competition. Europeans discovered they could produce salt through solar evaporation of seawater along the coast. This sea salt wasn't quite the same as Saharan rock salt. It had different properties and different cultural associations, but it was adequate for most purposes and significantly cheaper. Coastal production of salt undermined the price structure that had made Tagaza profitable. Songhai, still dominating trans-Saharan trade, tried to adapt. They attempted to establish their own coastal connections and maintain control of interior trade routes. But they were fighting economic geography. Moving goods by sea was simply more efficient than moving them across the Sahara. The fundamental advantage that distance and difficulty had provided, the high profit margins from geographic arbitrage, was being eliminated by maritime technology. In 1591, the Moroccan Empire invaded Songhai, ostensibly over control of Tagaza's salt mines. The Moroccan forces, equipped with firearms obtained from European trade, defeated Songhai's larger but less technologically advanced army at the Battle of Tondibi. This military conquest is sometimes portrayed as the moment trans-Saharan trade died, but that's oversimplified. The trade was already declining due to maritime competition. The Moroccan conquest accelerated a process that was already well underway. The Moroccan occupation of the Middle Niger region was chaotic and ultimately unstable. The occupiers couldn't effectively control the vast territory, couldn't stop the economic shift toward maritime trade, and within decades had fragmented into competing local powers. But the damage to Songhai was permanent. The centralized state that had organized and protected trans-Saharan trade collapsed. Without that organizational framework, caravans faced higher risks, fewer protections, and less certainty that wells would be maintained and routes secured. The 17th and 18th centuries saw continued decline. Trans-Saharan trade didn't stop. Caravans still crossed the desert, salt still moved south, goods still moved north, but the scale diminished. The great merchant houses that had funded thousand-camel caravans struggled or failed. Cities that had prospered on trade revenues declined. Timbuktu, once one of the wealthiest cities in Africa, became increasingly marginalized as European coastal trade grew. By the 19th century, when European explorers and colonizers began seriously penetrating the West African interior, they found the remnants of a trading system that had been much greater. The accounts they wrote often portrayed the region as always having been backward and undeveloped, which was either ignorant or deliberately misleading. They were seeing the end stage of a centuries-long decline, not the original state. Those who remember learning about African history in school, if it was taught at all, likely learned this colonial-era narrative that portrayed Africa as lacking sophisticated civilization before European contact. That narrative was always false, but particularly so regarding the trans-Saharan trade. The empires built on this trade were as sophisticated as any medieval state, with comparable levels of organization, wealth, and cultural achievement. Their decline had less to do with any inherent limitations and more to do with the accident of geography. They'd built their power on controlling overland routes that became obsolete when maritime technology advanced. We need to address something that's been present throughout this story, but not explicitly discussed: slavery. The trans-Saharan trade networks that moved salt and gold also moved human beings. The scale was enormous. The suffering was real, and any honest accounting of this history must acknowledge it directly. This is not a comfortable topic, but history isn't obligated to be comfortable. Estimates suggest that between the 7th and 20th centuries, somewhere between 6 and 9 million enslaved people were transported across the Sahara from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Middle East. For comparison, the transatlantic slave trade, which gets far more attention in Western education, transported roughly 12 million people. The trans-Saharan trade was comparable in scale and lasted far longer, over 1,000 years, compared to roughly 350 years for the Atlantic trade. The mechanics were brutal. Enslaved people were captured in raids or purchased from regions at war, then marched across the Sahara in the same caravans that carried salt and other goods. The journey that was difficult for free men was catastrophic for enslaved people. They received less food, less water, and no rest when they needed it. They were literally property, valued less than the camels carrying them. When someone couldn't continue, they were left behind to die. The Sahara is littered with the bones of people who didn't survive the crossing. The mortality rate for enslaved people crossing the Sahara was horrific. Estimates range from 15 to 30% dying en route. Compare that to the transatlantic slave trade's roughly 13% mortality rate during the Middle Passage, and you get a sense of how deadly the Saharan crossing was. The difference was that ships, however horrific their conditions, made the journey in weeks. The Sahara took months of walking while chained, undernourished, and brutalized. The enslaved who survived found themselves in various situations depending on their destination and characteristics. Young women were often destined for domestic service or concubinage in North African households. Young men might become agricultural laborers in oasis communities or urban workers. Some became soldiers. The Moroccan army that conquered Songhai included many enslaved soldiers originally from sub-Saharan Africa. Children might be raised in their owner's household, sometimes achieving relatively better positions, but still fundamentally enslaved. The salt mines at Tagaza, as we discussed earlier, were worked primarily by enslaved labor. This was considered among the worst fates, life expectancy measured in years at best. Other enslaved people worked in date plantations at Saharan oases, which was harsh but not quite as deadly as the mines. Some became domestic servants in wealthy households, which could range from relatively tolerable to nightmarish depending on the owner. It's important to note that this slavery was different in some ways from the plantation slavery of the Americas. In Islamic societies, slavery operated under different legal frameworks. Enslaved people had some limited rights. Conversion to Islam could sometimes improve their status, and there were paths to freedom, though they were difficult. But let's be clear, these differences don't make it acceptable. Slavery is the theft of human life and liberty, whatever form it takes. The trans-Saharan slave trade was integrated into the broader trading system. Enslaved people were cargo alongside salt, gold, and ivory. The same merchants, the same caravans, the same financial networks that made the salt trade possible also made the slave trade possible. The prosperity of Timbuktu, the wealth of Mali, the power of Songhai, all built partly on this human trafficking. This is an uncomfortable truth, but historical honesty requires acknowledging it. Different African societies participated in this trade to varying degrees. Some kingdoms and peoples specialized in slave raiding, targeting their neighbors for captives to sell. Others were victims, more than participants. The dynamics were complex and varied by region and period, but the overall pattern was clear. The demand for enslaved labor in North Africa and the Middle East, combined with the profits available, created powerful incentives for capture and sale. This continued well into the colonial period. European colonization of Africa in the late 19th century officially opposed slavery. European powers used ending the slave trade as a justification for colonization. In practice, this was often hypocritical, as colonial labor systems weren't dramatically better than slavery, but the trans-Saharan slave trade did gradually decline through the 20th century, finally ending, officially, though underground forms persisted, by the mid-20th century. Those who served in North Africa during World War II, or those whose fathers told stories from that theater, might have encountered echoes of these old systems still functioning decades ago. The full end of trans-Saharan slavery is within living memory, which should give us pause. This isn't ancient history in a distant past. This happened to people whose descendants are alive today. Why discuss this now? Because any honest treatment of the trans-Saharan trade requires acknowledging all of what moved along those routes, not just the salt and gold that built empires and fostered cultural exchange. The same networks, the same economic incentives, the same human ingenuity that accomplished remarkable things also enabled and profited from tremendous suffering. History is complicated that way. The capacity for both achievement and atrocity often exists in the same systems, enabled by the same people. What's left of the Great Salt Road today? The physical evidence is fragmentary, scattered across thousands of miles of desert and savanna, but it exists for those who know where to look and what they're seeing. Tagaza itself was largely abandoned in the 16th century in favor of other salt sources like Taudeni, which still operates today using methods not dramatically different from medieval times. The old mining sites remain, depressions in the salt flats, weathered remnants of salt block structures, scattered debris from centuries of extraction. Archaeologists who've studied the site find evidence of the scale of operations, extensive excavations, waste piles, the foundations of temporary structures. But there's little to see for the casual observer. The Sahara doesn't preserve settlements well. What the sun doesn't destroy, the wind erodes, or the sand covers. The caravan routes themselves are harder to trace. Desert sand shifts, dunes migrate, landmarks disappear. But in some areas, particularly where routes crossed rocky Hamada, you can still see traces. Worn paths where centuries of camel traffic compressed the ground, cairns that marked turns, or water sources, and occasionally, artifacts. Archaeologists have found pottery fragments, metal tools, remnants of cargo, and skeletal remains of camels and humans who didn't complete the journey. The wells that made the routes possible are the most persistent physical evidence. Many are still in use, maintained by modern communities or travelers. Some are ancient, dug 1,000 years ago and continuously maintained since. The engineering of these deep desert wells is impressive even by modern standards. Excavating a 100-foot well through sand and rock using hand tools, then maintaining it in an environment where a single collapsed wall could mean death for the next caravan to arrive, required skill and continuous effort. The cities that prospered on the salt trade have fared better as archaeological sites. Timbuktu still exists, though much diminished from its medieval glory. The mosques remain, rebuilt many times, but occupying the same sites and following the same architectural principles. The libraries, despite suffering from neglect, warfare, and deliberate destruction, have preserved remarkable collections. Thousands of manuscripts from Timbuktu's golden age survived, providing our most detailed information about the period. Modern preservation efforts are trying to save what remains, though it's a race against time, environmental damage, and political instability. Djenné's Great Mosque still dominates the city, rebuilt annually in a tradition that maintains techniques from centuries ago. It's one of the most remarkable architectural monuments in Africa, built entirely from local materials, using methods developed to suit the environment. The city itself shows layers of occupation going back over 1,000 years. Archaeologists excavating there have found evidence of the medieval trading center, coins, pottery, metal goods, evidence of craft production, and objects from as far away as Europe and Asia, demonstrating the city's international connections. Gao, less well-preserved than Timbuktu or Djenné, still has visible remains of the Songhai period. The tombs of Askia rulers, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, demonstrate the architectural ambitions of the empire. Recent archaeology has uncovered evidence of extensive urban development, craft production, and trade connections during Gao's prime. Scattered across West Africa are other archaeological traces of the salt trade's cultural impact. Architectural styles that show North African influence in regions connected by trade. Decorative patterns in textiles and metalwork that demonstrate cultural exchange. Distinctive pottery styles that spread along trade routes. For archaeologists, these material traces tell the story of connection and exchange across the Sahara. The genetic legacy is even more persistent than the physical one. Population genetic studies show clear evidence of gene flow between North Africa and West Africa, consistent with centuries of trade contact. The patterns indicate not just the movement of enslaved people, but also voluntary migration of traders and their families, intermarriage, and the gradual mixing of populations along trade routes. DNA doesn't care about historical narratives. It simply records what happened. And what it records is extensive contact between populations across the Sahara over many centuries. Linguistic evidence tells a similar story. Loan words from Arabic entered West African languages through trade contact. Commercial and religious terminology in particular shows these influences. Conversely, some West African words entered North African languages, particularly terms related to trade goods, geographic features of the Sahel, and cultural practices unique to sub-Saharan societies. Language, like genes, records contact and exchange. Cultural practices that originated or spread through trade contact persist in modified forms. The tea ceremony central to Tuareg culture arrived via trade networks. Certain musical traditions show evidence of cross-Saharan influence. Architectural techniques adapted from North African models remain visible in West African buildings. Religious practices, particularly in Islamic communities, show the synthesis of Arabian Islamic traditions with local customs, a blending that occurred through trade contact. Modern communities maintain cultural memories of the trade era. Among Tuareg groups, the traditions of desert navigation, caravan organization, and trade practice are passed down even though the economic system that required them has largely disappeared. Stories, songs, and oral histories preserve memories of the salt trade period, though obviously filtered through centuries of retelling. These aren't precise historical records, but they maintain the cultural memory that this was important, that ancestors participated in something remarkably. The trans-Saharan salt trade hasn't entirely disappeared. It continues in diminished form, using methods that would be recognizable to a medieval merchant. Taoudeni, about 200 miles northwest of Timbuktu, still produces salt that's transported by camel caravan to markets in Mali and neighboring countries. The scale is tiny compared to the medieval trade, a few hundred camel loads instead of thousands, but the essential process is unchanged. Modern miners at Taoudeni work in conditions that would be familiar to their medieval counterparts, which is not a compliment. The work remains brutal, dangerous, and poorly paid. Salt blocks are still cut by hand, still loaded on camels, still transported across desert to markets where they're sold. The primary difference is that modern salt from Taoudeni competes with industrial salt production, which limits prices and profits. Today's miners work as hard as those in the past, but earn less in real terms because industrial alternatives have collapsed the market. The caravans that carry this salt follow routes similar to the medieval ones, though shortened because modern transportation has changed the economics. A typical modern caravan might travel 2 or 3 weeks to reach a market town where the salt is transferred to trucks for final distribution. This hybrid system, traditional extraction and initial transport, then modern logistics, represents the compromise between ancient methods and contemporary economics. Why does this continue at all when industrial salt is cheaper? Several reasons. First, Saharan rock salt has different mineral content than sea salt, giving it slightly different properties that some consumers prefer for specific uses. Second, in very remote areas, transportation costs for industrial salt can actually make local Saharan salt competitive. Third, and perhaps most important, cultural preference matters. For some communities, Saharan rock salt carries cultural significance that industrial alternatives lack. It's the salt of tradition, of history, of identity. There's also a small tourism component. Adventure travelers sometimes join salt caravans as paying participants, seeking authentic desert experiences. This brings in additional revenue that helps sustain the practice. Whether this tourism is preserving a dying tradition or turning it into a performance for outsiders is debatable, but it does create economic incentive for continuation. Elsewhere, in the Sahara, other small-scale traditional trade continues. Dates, handicrafts, livestock, and other goods still move by camel caravan in regions where roads are poor or non-existent. These aren't the massive caravans of the medieval period, but the knowledge and skills required haven't been entirely lost. Some Tuareg and other desert peoples maintain these traditions as part of their cultural identity, even when purely economic calculations would favor abandoning them for modern alternatives. The Salt Road's legacy appears in unexpected modern contexts. The routes followed by medieval caravans have influenced modern road construction. In some areas, engineers sometimes route highways along paths that proved practical for camel travel, because those paths found the best grades and the most reliable water sources. Some modern border crossing points between Saharan countries reflect medieval trade patterns located where caravans historically passed. Economic patterns established during the salt trade era persist in modified form. Cities that grew wealthy on trade remain regional commercial centers, though now they're trading different goods via different methods. The business networks, family connections, and commercial relationships developed over centuries of salt trade created social capital that has been redirected toward modern economic opportunities. A family that grew wealthy, outfitting caravans 500 years ago, might today run a transportation logistics company, applying different technology to similar problems. As we near the end of this journey, it's worth reflecting on what the story of the Great Salt Road can teach us. History isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding patterns, recognizing our place in longer arcs of change, and maybe gaining some perspective on our own times. First, the Salt Road demonstrates how geography shapes civilization. For 1,000 years, the difficulty of crossing the Sahara created the conditions for certain kinds of political and economic systems. Empires rose by controlling routes and taxing trade. Cities prospered by connecting different economic zones. The very harshness of the environment created the value that made the trade worthwhile. Then, maritime technology changed the equation, and systems that had seemed permanent and powerful collapsed within generations. Geography is powerful, but technology can overcome geographic constraints, fundamentally altering what's possible. Those who lived through the massive technological changes of the 20th century, from pre-television to internet, from horse carts to space travel, might recognize this pattern. Systems that seem permanent can be overturned rapidly when technology shifts the underlying constraints. The Salt Road empires fell to ships the way manufacturing towns fell to automation, the way Main Street businesses fell to online retail. The specific technologies differ, but the pattern of disruption is familiar. Second, the Salt Road shows how interconnected human societies have always been. We sometimes imagine the past as consisting of isolated communities that rarely interacted with distant peoples. But the reality, at least in some times and places, was extensive, long-distance contact. Ideas, goods, genes, diseases, and cultural practices moved across enormous distances. The Sahara, one of the most forbidding barriers on Earth, was crossed regularly by people seeking profit and connection. If they could overcome that obstacle, we should hesitate before declaring any distance or difference too great for human interaction. The manuscript collections of Timbuktu contain texts from Persia, Arabia, North Africa, and local West African authors, all studied together in a remote desert city. That kind of intellectual cosmopolitanism challenges simple narratives about isolated, parochial medieval societies. The global exchange of ideas and goods that we think of as modern was happening in different forms centuries ago. Third, the Salt Road reminds us that economic value is contextual and can shift dramatically. Salt was worth its weight in gold because specific communities desperately needed it and couldn't easily obtain it. Once supply routes changed, that value collapsed. This is a lesson worth remembering in our own economy. Things that seem valuable today, specific skills, particular resources, certain business models, may lose that value rapidly if circumstances change. The merchant who specialized in trans-Saharan salt caravans around 1450 seemed to have a secure, profitable trade. By 1550, that trade was collapsing. Adaptability matters. Fourth, the history demonstrates both human capacity for remarkable achievement and for terrible cruelty, often within the same systems. The empires of the Salt Road created centers of learning that preserved and advanced human knowledge. They built architectural monuments that still impress today. They developed sophisticated commercial and legal systems, and they sustained their power partly through enslaving millions of people. Both things are true. The achievement doesn't excuse the atrocity, but the atrocity doesn't erase the achievement. Historical honesty requires holding both realities simultaneously. Fifth, the Salt Road shows how crucial infrastructure is to civilization. The wells, the way stations, the maintained routes, the security provided by organized states, all of this infrastructure made long-distance trade possible. When states collapsed and infrastructure wasn't maintained, trade declined even though the fundamental demand for goods remained. Infrastructure isn't exciting, isn't dramatic, doesn't make for heroic stories. But without it, complex economies and the civilizations they support become impossible. Every time you turn on a tap and water flows, remember those medieval wells dug by hand through rock and constantly maintained because the alternative was death. For those whose generation built the interstate highway system, the electrical grid, the water systems of modern America, this might resonate. That infrastructure, built with tremendous effort and expense, makes modern life possible. Let it decay, and civilization itself begins to fail. The empires of the Salt Road understood this. They invested in wells, protected caravans, maintained routes. When they weakened and couldn't sustain that investment, their power crumbled. Sixth, the story reminds us that historical importance and modern attention don't always align. For 1,000 years, the Ghana-Mali-Songhai succession was as important to global history as anything happening in Europe or Asia. Timbuktu was as significant a city as Paris or Baghdad. The trans-Saharan trade moved as much value as the Silk Road. Yet most Westerners, if they know anything about this history, know a few disconnected facts they half remember from school. This reflects not the actual historical importance, but rather whose history gets told, preserved, and taught. It's a reminder to question whose perspectives dominate historical narratives and what might be missing. Finally, the Salt Road teaches a lesson about perspective and time. The empires that seemed eternal to their inhabitants lasted a few centuries, then collapsed or transformed into something else. The trade routes that carried the wealth of nations are now forgotten tracks in the sand. The great merchants whose names were known across Africa are largely forgotten, their wealth dispersed, their descendants lost to time. 1,000 years is long from a human perspective, but brief in historical terms. Nothing is permanent. Every powerful institution, every wealthy family, every apparently eternal arrangement eventually ends. This could be depressing, but it can also be liberating. If nothing is permanent, then current problems and injustices aren't permanent either. Systems can change, because systems always change, eventually. The people who built empires on salt trade probably couldn't imagine those empires falling, but fall they did. Whatever seems unchangeable in our own time will also eventually change. At the same time, this impermanence doesn't mean nothing matters. The manuscript collections of Timbuktu survived centuries of neglect and warfare because people valued them enough to preserve them. The wells of the Sahara continue functioning because someone, generation after generation, maintained them. The stories survived because someone told them to their children. Permanence is impossible, but persistence across generations, creating things that outlast us, is achievable if we choose to value it. As we come to the end of tonight's journey, picture this. Somewhere in the Sahara right now, a small caravan is making its way across the sand. The men leading those camels are following routes that have been used for over 1,000 years. The stars they navigate by are the same stars medieval Tuareg guides followed. The wells they depend on were dug by ancestors centuries dead. The cargo they carry, blocks of salt cut from the earth, has changed not at all in a millennium. That continuation, fragile as it is, connects us directly to the world we've explored tonight. The Great Salt Road, the empires it built, the wealth it created, the suffering it enabled, the cultural exchange it facilitated. All of this happened. Real people lived these experiences. Their descendants are alive today. The landscape they crossed remains largely unchanged. Still harsh, still testing human endurance, still beautiful in its desolation. We started tonight by asking what might be the most valuable commodity in history. Salt was the answer, but not because of any inherent property. Salt was valuable because of where it was needed and how difficult it was to obtain. Geography created scarcity. Scarcity created value. Value created opportunity. Opportunity created empires. Then technology changed geography's meaning, and everything that had seemed solid and permanent shifted like sand in the wind. The people who lived this history were not fundamentally different from us. They loved their families, pursued profit, endured suffering, created beauty, committed atrocities, achieved remarkable things, and died as everyone dies. Their specific concerns, the price of salt in Timbuktu, the danger of the next crossing, the maintenance of a well, the success of a harvest, were their whole world. From our perspective centuries later, we can see patterns they couldn't, understand outcomes they never knew. But we should remember that our own concerns, which seem so immediate and important, will one day be distant history to people who see patterns we cannot. There's a saying that the Sahara preserves nothing except memory. The physical traces erode, the cities decay, the routes are covered by sand, but the memory, carried forward in stories and songs and written records and archaeological fragments, persists. Tonight, we've tried to recover some of that memory, to resurrect a world that's largely forgotten despite its historical importance. For those of you who served in North Africa, or who remember learning world geography before our education became so narrowly focused, or who've traveled through desert country, I hope tonight's content resonated with your own experiences. The Sahara you might have known is the same Sahara that tested caravans centuries ago. The human responses to that environment, careful planning, mutual dependence, respect for the power of nature, and the occasional flash of humor in the face of hardship, those remain constant across time. If tonight's topic brought back memories, or if you've got stories your father or grandfather told you about desert service, about North Africa, about times when resources we take for granted were scarce and precious, I'd be honored if you shared them in the comments Your generation holds history that's not in books. If you're willing to share your perspective or experiences, the comments section is yours. The younger folks watching need to hear from those who remember when salt was something you kept in a special container because it actually mattered. When travel meant real hardship and risk. When trade required trusting your life to others' competence. The Great Salt Road is gone. The empires it built have fallen. The cities it enriched have declined. The wealth it generated has been spent. But the story remains, and in remembering it, we honor those who lived it. We acknowledge their struggles, their achievements, their humanity. We recognize that they were as real as we are, that their lives mattered as much as ours, that their forgotten world was once as vivid and important as our world is to us now. Somewhere in the Sahara tonight, under those same ancient stars, a small caravan presses on toward morning. The men with those camels carry forward a tradition over 1,000 years old, connecting us directly to the world we've explored. They probably don't think of themselves as living history. They're just doing a job, earning a living, crossing a desert. But in their persistence, in their continued willingness to face hardship for salt, they keep alive something precious, a direct link to a past that shaped the world we inherited. And in the quiet of this history, their voices still echo, if we're willing to listen. The miner at Tagaza, who never saw the cities his labor enriched. The merchant who risked everything on one more crossing. The guide who brought caravans safely home when others got lost. The scholar who copied manuscripts by candlelight. The families who waited months, not knowing if their loved ones would return. They all lived and struggled, and in their own ways, mattered. Their struggles became our foundation. Their resilience, passed down through generations, is part of why we're here. The salt they carried, the roots they blazed, the cities they built, the knowledge they preserved, all of it contributed to the world we inherited. We are beneficiaries of their endurance, whether we know their names or not. Now rest well, and I'll see you in the next one. The past may be silent, but it is never truly gone. It's written in the genes we carry, the languages we speak, the stories we tell, and the sand beneath the forgotten roads that once carried empires on their shoulders. Safe travels wherever your own roads lead.